and welcome to today's conversation, the global economic governance. Can fragmentation be overcome? Oh, I believe I have set the PowerPoint in motion. My name's Adam Tooze. I'm the director of the European Institute and delighted to welcome you here to this event tonight. And it's a particular delight to welcome our speaker, Marco Buti, who is Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs at the EU Commission. The Director General for Economic and Financial Affairs is the department of the European Commission responsible for EU policies promoting economic growth, higher employment, stable public finances and financial stability. Marco has been Director General there for almost 10 years. You started in the midst of the 2008 financial crisis. They've been extremely active years since he took office there. He works directly with the EU Commissioner competent in this field, Pierre Moscovici, who we had the pleasure of welcoming to Colombia only a month ago. Before that, Marco served in a number of prominent positions in the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs. He was also an economic advisor to the President of the European Commission, Romano Prodi, until 2003. That was the Commission that oversaw the introduction of the euro. Marco studied economics at the Universities of Florence and Oxford. He's been a visiting professor at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, the University of Florence, and at the European University Institute in Florence as well. And he's published extensively on fiscal and monetary policy. If there ever was a combination of intellectual and policymaker, Marco fits that bill. He's also very well known to us in the Colombia community. We've had the great pleasure of welcoming him. It feels like a regular visit almost now. I think this is your third visit during my watch. It's become a really sustained conversation, which is an absolute delight. And we're very much looking forward to hearing his thoughts today about global economic governance. Europe is not front and centre immediately in this, but we've already started the conversation at the frontier about the implications of the weekend's elections in Hesse. So I know that this is absolutely top of stack for him, and I look forward to questions on that, if not from me, then from the audience. We're going to start with a presentation by Marco, and then we'll have a discussion and question and answer session that follows. Before we do that, I'd like to thank the Centre on Global Economic Governance at CEPA, which is co-sponsoring this event with us and hosting us here on the top of this lovely building. And let me also add that this event is made possible thanks to the generous support of the European Union's Erasmus Programme, of which we are now a beneficiary, which makes us a centre of excellence of the EU, a great leap forward for the European Institute, which would not have been possible without the relentless, tireless work of Francois and Sharon Kim, who've made this all possible. But first of all, let me ask you to join me in welcoming Director General Marco Buti to New York and to Colombia once more.
Thank you very much, Adam. Thanks for inviting me. Indeed, as you said, it has become a regular event. Hopefully it will continue in the future. Maybe with the coming, I may come here with a different capacity. And as you said, I have seen it all since 2008. I thought I had seen it all, but I can still see things that one should be surprised about if you take a bit of more mainstream views. And the issue of global governance fragmentation is probably one of the things where you have to rub your eyes to believe certain things. And I certainly. Having had the experience of the relaunch of the G20, actually you document very nicely in your latest book, and see the reversal of fortunes in the past 18 months. I think one has to, maybe draw a line and try to start afresh, at least to think in a bit of a more innovative way. So what? The plan for today, this is the outline. I think expectations and reality. So what happened to our early beliefs? And then I would like to go through a number of fragmentations which have come to the fore during the crisis and which we carry with us still, even though the main the main problems of the crisis are, to a certain sense, over, and then how to overcome the divides that we have in the world economy. And here I would like to put forward the view that multilateralism has to be preserved. I think our prosperity depends on that, but we have to renew it. I don't like maybe too much to talk about multilateralism 2.0, but I think better, at least from my viewpoint, talk about inclusive multilateralism, to take into account the fact that globalization has allowed to increase prosperity, at the same time has left many behind. And then what roles for individual players? Here, individual players is essentially the US, China, and Europe in the big context. So that is the plan. Our early beliefs, you remember Maynard Keynes is the early beliefs he was talking about liberalism and so forth at those times. So what were our early beliefs? If one goes back basically 2 decades ago, about integration, globalization, I think I've summarized here, maybe in a, let's say, first order fashion, what we thought at the time. We had a very benign view of globalization and integration. I think a fortiori even more in the case of Europe, which in a sense was an experience of globalization at the regional scale. So with the emphasis was on overall gains on trade, capital market liberalization, and financial integration. I think the focus was on the implication of capital movements, not labor flows. We thought labor was largely immobile, so what we had to take care of was to avoid race to the bottom led by rapid capital movements. The distributional impact was acknowledged, but it was actually belittled very much. It was along skills and spatial dimension, but we thought was overall manageable, in particular in Europe, considering our well-developed welfare system. We thought that this was something that one could manage. And we had overall a great faith in the functioning multilateral institutions at the global level, the Bretton Woods institutions, WTO, and in Europe, our own institutional setting to deal with imbalances via coordinated policy actions. And, last thing was, democracy and economic liberalism would go hand in hand. So this was 20 years ago. Close your eyes and fast forward to today, and what do we have? First of all, we had a rather uncritical view of downhill capital flows. So capital flow would actually go from the center to the periphery. That would be essential in order to boost productivity, growth, total factor productivity, and to foster catching up in economies, in emerging economies. In reality, capital movements actually did not have only these positive effects. Actually, there was the crisis showed that it was a destabilizing factors, and even in Europe, if I take the experience that we have, actually capital flew downhill, but it largely ended up in the wrong place. So it went to Ireland, to Spain, to Greece, but it went in the wrong place. It actually fueled bubbles and asset market housing booms, which came back to haunt us when the sudden stop of capital movements. I said before the worries was about capital movements, and we thought labor would not be a huge issue. We had not anticipated migration that would hit us very hard. And so the crisis actually has not been provoked even at the political level by capital movement so much, but by people's movement and labor movement, so migration. And the fact that we could not manage this at national level, and we have had in Europe in particular quite a lot of difficulties in dealing with that at the global level through a coordinated action. Increasing and persistent regional disparities also emerged. Here, agglomeration effects are actually stronger than what we had anticipated at the time, and this also went hand in hand with a negative impact on working conditions. I think this could have been better anticipated, because actually, if you take a standard trade theory, when you integrate economies of different level of developments, those who suffer here are actually the let's say the blue collars in rich countries. So this is, if you take action rolling theory, that is precisely the prediction that one had. And the distributional impact was actually bigger than expected. It was not only at the bottom of the productivity scale, but also higher up. And what we have seen, the stagnation of the median income was actually, from a political viewpoint, actually more of a problem than problems at the bottom end of the distribution, because there you can compensate and sustain income at the bottom end of the income distribution. If you have stagnation of median income, that is much more complicated. And politically, those earning the median income, they are also the median voter. So the impact on politics was actually very significant. Systemic risk from unbridled financial markets, I mentioned it before. And finally, the real or perceived loss of control vis-a-vis business, financial sector. So the taking back control has become an important element driving, rightly or wrongly, the management of economic policy, if not policy to cool. So this was what we are left with now, and we have to deal with these matters here. Now, the globalization as perceived threat is actually comes out of many analysis polls, and this is just one. You can see that the perception of globalization as a threat versus as an opportunity for the working class and low-level education, the results are very, very similar. The two samples actually overlap pretty much. And you can see that the working class, the economic anxiety versus economic confidence, also those have been holding a bit more traditional value versus more progressive values. Here is very close. Globalization threat versus opportunity. If you compare this with the middle class, you can see that the gap there, and largely the same emerges in if you look at the level of education. So this is something we have to reckon with, and the perception of globalization actually being an issue and a problem is pretty widespread. Now, we have undergone global economy, Europe in particular, through an existential crisis, which was very severe. Again, Adam's book documents that very extensively, and we are left with a number of legacies which are going to be with us actually for quite a while. So there are the fragmentations, they can be declined along different dimensions. Okay, one of these is a political fragmentation. Let me take through this chart here, which is a little bit imaginative and possibly a little bit controversial also. it is north-south and east-west divides in Europe, in which geography plays a role, but not not fully. So what basically you have here is that the north-south divide is along responsibility versus solidarity, which in the current Parliament, if I look at the discussions on completion of the architecture of economic and monetary union, is risk reduction versus risk sharing. So countries in the north, they put the emphasis essentially on risk reduction and responsibility. Countries in the south, they put the emphasis more on risk sharing and solidarity. Then you have the east-west divide, which is more, especially after the enlargement of the EU, on sovereignism versus pro-integrationist approach. And you can place this into you can place the countries, and have done it. This is a completely subjective way of placing the countries in the four quadrants. And you can see some countries actually are steady in their quadrant. Others actually are tend to move around. And the experience of the past few weeks actually shows that these movements is to be serious. Now take the quadrant here on pro-EU and emphasis on responsibility, so risk reduction. You have Germany clearly in that camp. There, and what I have the oval there you see about Nordic, Baltics, and the Netherlands is actually group of countries which have emphasized even more than Germany the issue of risk reduction. And Prime Minister Rutte, including in the latest European Council 2 weeks ago, very much took the lead on emphasizing this. So being ill at ease compared to attempts by France and Germany to put together an agreement on how to complete economic and monetary union, and being resistant to the Meseberg Declaration, which was put together before the summer, so in last June. That's why the Netherlands, playing a leading role in this. What you see also in this quadrant here, you have two countries actually moving and changing space. On the one hand, you have Austria, after the latest elections, actually putting much more emphasis on sovereignist, let's say, feelings and positions. And you have Spain here, which for quite a while was pretty close to Germany, benefiting also from the assistance to support the banks during the crisis, which with the latest change in governments actually tended to more to the south, entering the camp of remaining pro-EU, but more emphasis on solidarity. If you move down, you have Italy, and here I don't have to elaborate too much. There is a clear tendency here of moving towards more sovereignist views, and in the other countries more on the new member states. So Eastern Europe, some are more on the let's say responsibility side. So Slovakia, Czech Republic, close to the to Germany, to German feelings on that in terms of attitude towards integration, and you have Hungary and Poland that I put in that quadrant here with strong sovereignty attitude. So this is so in a sense what you have is that they have the divides, which are the traditional ones is let's say the north-south, If you take the latest developments in the past couple of years, so the East-West have become, I think, more pronounced, and it has become more pronounced in particular on the issue of migration, which has heightened the spirits quite a lot. So political fragmentation is one development. Now I have focused here on intra-EU, and the political fragmentation at the global level, US, Europe, China, etc., in a sense, is even more glaring. Second one is financial fragmentation. Here, what we have here is two measures of financial integration or fragmentation. One is a composite indicators based on prices. So and interest rates yields. So this is the yellow curve, and then you have the other one based on quantity. So how much the banking and financial systems are integrated. So cross-border mergers and acquisitions here also is a composite indicators, and you can see here the vertical lines are key moments of introduction of the euro, the beginning of the subprime crisis, Lehman Brothers, and then the sovereign debt crisis, and the basically whatever it takes, and the OMT, whatever it takes of Mario Draghi. And what you can, and here when the indicator goes towards one, it's more integration, less fragmentation, and the opposite when you move down. What emerges here is that in terms of prices, convergence of prices, actually fragmentation has gone back to the pre-crisis level, not to the levels achieved in the mid of 2000, but the level of 2007, 2008. There has been a recovery also in terms of quantity. So, but by far less complete. Now here clearly prices move much more quickly than quantity. So there is an element here of time lag which plays. Nonetheless, I think there is still a way to go on the integration of financial banking systems, and we have not achieved the level of integration that we had pre-crisis. In terms of quantity. So this is something that continues to stay with us, another legacy of the crisis. Now then there is social fragmentation, and here I'm very proud of this graph, so I hope you like it. If you don't like it, don't tell me, because I will be upset. So what you have here is my version of the elephant graph turning into a whale. No, the elephant graph, you remember, is Branko Milanovic. You have all seen you have the trunk of the. So in his version, which looks actually at the 20 years before the crisis, and then the elephant has become less appealing if you put the following years. You had those who suffered were essentially those left out, so sub-Saharan Africa and the excluded from globalization, and in his initial interpretation also basically the working class, the blue collars who feared globalization that I showed you in the initial in one of the previous slides. Is the bottom of the trunk of the elephant, and then those who gained are the top 1%. So what I've done here is the same result, but it turns out more like a whale than an elephant here. And what you can see here is that if you look at the right hand side there, the 1% is broken into 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, etc. So there is an element there of compression of the or extension of the scale, and you can see the graph actually pointing vertically very much. So, and the message here, those that I try to capture in the little messages there, You see the rise of the emerging countries towards the left here, the squeeze of the median and low income in the US and Western Europe, and then the appropriations of the large share of income and add wealth. This is not, it doesn't cover wealth, by the top 1, top 01, top 001, top 0001, which is, goes vertically up. So there is the feeling that globalization integration has worked in a very, differentiated way, and the trickle down has not really worked, and the stagnation of the median wage, median income, which is basically here, has I think has left a lot of discontent. And if one thinks about inclusive multilateralism, then this is an issue that we'll have to deal with. And then at the global level, we have also experienced institutional fragmentation. I think basically what organized the global economic governance before the crisis were the Bretton Woods institutions. Everything rotated around that, and what has happened since then is the creation of new arrangements. WTO, which has become less of it has moved from the center to the periphery. Actually, in this arrangement here, we have had a number of regional financing arrangements which have been put in place, most notably the ESM. This is good because they complement actually the resources of the IMF, but there is less of a coordination and unison of purposes in this. And most importantly, what you see on the right-hand side there, creation of new multilateral development banks, the BRICS banks, Asian infrastructure investment banks, which let's say add to the capacity, but they have also created more complexity in the system, and also the perception that some of these new multilateral development banks actually compete with the existing ones for reasons which are not always related to let's say boosting development and fostering growth, but maybe responding to different logics. Plus new bilateral lenders, China in particular, which via the Silk Road, the new Silk Road, has entered into relations with recipient countries which lack transparency and may actually lead to creation of dependency, which is a risk to be problematic. I'll come back to that in a moment. So institutional fragmentation has been relevant in the past several years, and another form of fragmentation is the renewed global imbalances. Now, at the overall level, you can see here, if you take 2007 and 2017, so the 10 years beginning of the crisis and basically current situation, overall global imbalances have been reduced. You see the size, the overall size, but the composition has changed also very dramatically. Basically, just before the crisis, you had China and the emerging economies being essentially responsible for the global imbalances on the surplus side, and the US on the deficit side, and the euro area was broadly balanced. Fast forward to today, you can see China, actually the imbalance has decreased very substantially, and now the global imbalance is essentially a question of the developed economies, or the advanced economies. And you see the euro area having moved into substantial surplus, and the US having remained in substantial deficit. And the interpretation in Europe is that this is a factor of strength for Europe because we are very strong, but this mercantilistic view actually is the wrong one. And this persistent large surplus actually makes us weak, not strong. And I think when we think about what to do, I'll come to that in a moment. For Europe, I think we'll have this issue here is something that we have to address. So what do we have to do? Overcoming the divides in search of inclusive multilateralism. First of all, we need to keep the global economy open. Here, what I have done is, and here I hope that an historian like Adam would appreciate this, is I have paired the Great Recession and the Great Depression. So basically putting 2008 and 1929 at the same level, and then showing the developments of the world trade as a percentage global GDP in the following 10 years. And basically the difference between the Great Depression of the 1930s and the Great Recession of the past 10 years is actually the integral between the two lines. In the Great Depression, following the Tariff Act of 1930, actually there was retaliation and trade war and a substantial move to autarky. And in the case of the global recession, so the latest crisis, there has been, I'll show it in a moment, there has been an increase in trade restrictions and measures, but we have not moved to outright protectionism, as was the case in the 1930s. I think this is one of the reasons why, even though with a lot of difficulties, I think we have managed not to slide into the repetition of the Great Depression. Here is the number of trade restrictive measures. As I mentioned, there has been an increase in that of the past 10 years since the crisis. So the standstill arrangement and agreement that we had at the level of the G20 did not hold. At the same time, many of these measures here are actually not WTO incompatible. Nonetheless, they create frictions. But what worries here is the dotted line. So whether we move from here and go to something which is considerably more worrying, which would actually lead to, potentially to a repetition of what we would not like to see here. How to recompose institutionally. So I think this is a way to look at it. I think we have to put the WTO, the IMF. The IMF here is behind that, so you don't see the name, but it has been overshadowed a bit by the others. But it remains at the center. It remains the pillar of the. And the World Bank and the Multilateral Development Bank actually working more as a system. So a recomposition of the institutional framework at the global level, which I think is important in order to have a coordinated approach. Now, an important report has been issued a couple of weeks ago, actually, and which it was discussed in Bali at the G20 by the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, Tharman, and family name is an impossible one. So it's the Tharman Group, Eminent Persons Group, which makes important proposals in 3 areas. In developments, making the multilateral development banks work as a system, so together with the World Bank and other IFIs, improving surveillance. This is essentially addressed to the fund, to the BIS, and on governance to refocus the G20 agenda, which has become pretty unruly now on economics and finance, to provide strategic guidance, strengthen corporate governance. And we think, the Commission in particular, we are very strongly supportive of this report. This was tasked by the German G20 presidency, and now they have made this report. There was a lot of enthusiasm when the group was launched, and the enthusiasm actually waned as time went by. And if one would go right now in a static approach, trying to figure out the lowest common denominator, I think we come out with almost an empty set. So what is going to be very important here is to keep the discussion going and to have a bit more of dynamic approach on this. And we hope and push to make sure that in the G20 next year, the presidency is Japan, we actually continue to discuss and try to see, to create consensus, at least on some of the proposals, in particular the one on development. Making multilateral development banks work as a system should be a relatively low-hanging fruit. Now, what is the role for individual players? Here, the summary is this one here. I think from the US, we had to recover some leadership of the right type. From inward looking strategy to pro-cyclical and overcome the current pro-cyclical policy mix. I mean, the U.S. economy growing very strongly, but on the back of a strongly pro-cyclical fiscal policy, which goes hand in hand with tightening of the Fed, strengthening of the dollar, and with important, let's say, negative implications for emerging economies, in particular emerging economies with large dollar-denominated debt. So recovering some, multilateral, more traditional multilateral approach. This is probably a bit of wishful thinking, but that's what I think we should do eventually. I think in Europe, I mentioned here, what I referred to before, so which is overcome the excessive reliance on external surpluses, so to move to a model of development and growth which is more indigenous and less relying on the external demand. I think, to be fair, if one looks at the past 2 years, and if you look at also the outlook right now, domestic demand is what underpins the current growth in Europe, in the euro area in particular. That has to become more structural. And so that is what we need to do. And I think for emerging markets in China in particular, to move to a less imbalanced growth model, to less market disruptive practice. So this is what these, in very general terms, the three main players in the global economy should do. If one looks at the more specifically, I go through these very quickly. So we reoccupy the role as an anchor of the rules-based multilateral system. I think we are talking to the US about a modernization of the WTO, and here multilateralism implies also reframing from unilateral action on trade, including against China. There has been a disengagement lately from international global fora, G20, G7, climate deal, and also institutions. I think this has to, there must be a rethink of this, and consider also the potential spillovers from domestic policy to the rest of the world, and the Paris Agreement is mentioned there. On China, I think the list of things to do is pretty clear, and I would say acknowledged also by the Chinese leadership, at least to a certain extent. What do we need to do? What do they need to do? I think there is a need to have further progress to tackle the steel excess capacity. I think this is steps that have been made, but they have to cross the river on this. to acknowledge and address the role of state-owned enterprises. SOE should actually behave by being led by commercial purposes, not, let's say, inverted comma, strategic ones. Ensuring a level playing field on export finance or export credits that have to be reined in. Enhancing debt transparency, and this is what I mentioned before. This is particularly important because it creates dependency, and we have seen also lately some examples of uneasiness and problems. And having an active engagement in the Paris Club, which is how to deal with in case of debt unsustainability. So all these elements here will have to be pursued. The problem with China now, and the question that they ask themselves, is that if we do this, is it going to be enough? Or is someone going to move the goalpost anyway? I think this is a serious question. And I have to say, if I take the attitude of China 6 months ago and the attitude of China now, they have become less open to deal with these matters here. I think one of the main reasons is precisely that they do not have an answer to that question that I just put. So if the feeling is that the goalpost would, whatever they do, would in any case be moved, then they are not going to engage in the first place. And finally, what is the role for Europe? I think in a sense Europe is, we have a system of governance relations in Europe which ideally should put ourselves in a good place to, as an example, to resolve conflicts and to promote cooperation. So I think we should exploit that. I think we have also the possibility to promote high standards of social and environmental protection, gender equality, and etc. Data privacy, the latest directive which has come into force on data protection, I think is a landmark for this. So, so what we have at the European level is actually, I'm not saying that the rest of the world or the global governance should take it literally and transpose it at the global level. Not saying that we have 60 years of cooperation in Europe, so that cannot be done. We cannot have a European approach to the G20. Nonetheless, I think it should be of inspiration, and certainly should be of inspiration for us in taking more responsibility at the global level. So I mentioned the continued commitment to an open level playing field in the global economy, WTO reforms, bilateral trade deals of a new generation. We have started with Canada, now with Mexico. So inserting in these standards which would tackle the issue of social fragmentation that I mentioned before, adapting to the digitalization of the economy. Here we are also at the forefront. The proposals on digital taxation that we have made and we are fostering at the G20, I think goes in the right direction. It is important also to tackle the populist backlash that we have. If the feeling is that these big conglomerates and big digital giants managed, one way or another to avoid to pay their fair share, and this contributes actually to the feeling that globalization does not work well for the man and woman in the street, and to continue to lead on climate deals. We have to do our homework. I mentioned it before. Here, external strength can only be based on internal cohesion. So risk of low structural growth. I think the growth has been rather buoyant lately. Now there is some deceleration of growth, but the problems of low potential growth have not been addressed fully yet. Tackle more effectively the inclusiveness challenge, complete economic and monetary union. We have a rendezvous now for the Euro area summit in December. Hopefully we managed to make some advancement on this. Hopefully we can do that, not counting on the ultima ratio, namely being pushed again with back against the wall before we take courageous decisions and deal with the Brexit challenge. So this is the domestic task. External task, you overcome the small country syndrome. We tend to refrain to take our political responsibility. So even though Europe as a whole is a major player, there is small country syndrome still affects the way we behave. Deal with the reverse creditor paradox. This is essentially what I mentioned before, namely being a creditor outside and having a persistent large surplus is not a factor of strength, it's a factor of weakness. So we have to move to a more indigenous growth model, and we also have to foster a more consistent representation in international fora. Here the resistance is huge, and so we actually punch well below our weight because of the fragmentation of the representation. And finally, this is a new chantier, is bolster the international role of the euro. So far, we have the policy has been no hinder, no promote. We are rather let's say neutral on this. I think it's time to consider reconsider the international role of the euro, actually to express our fully our monetary sovereignty. And all of us, meaning the main players, what we have to do together, I think here is a list of things. G20 lead by examples in respect to international rules. So I think here, okay, I think is here we are. So and the other elements which I have touched upon. So it's a long list of things to do. Is it too long? Possibly too long. One will have to prioritize this. Nonetheless, we are such a crucial juncture that I think we'll have to put all our effort to make sure that we do not slide into even more fragmented global economy, and which I think we would pay a very, very heavy price. Not only us, but also the future generations. Thank you.